So, in this episode, we are going to stay lighthearted. We're going to investigate a very common conversation question. In fact, one of my favorite podcasts uses this as the introduction question when they're getting to know a guest on the podcast, when they're just sharing about themselves. But I want to encourage you that this question we're going to talk about is not necessarily a conversation starter. It's a conversation question that you may ask after you've known somebody for a little while, just to have an interesting topic. Maybe you're at a social gathering and you want to interact with the other person, keep the conversation going after you've gone through the kind of most typical questions in small talk. This is to go deeper into a conversation, but also really just enjoy interacting with the other person. Today we're going to talk about the question, what are your guilty pleasures? You may also ask the question like we did last week in episode 17, which is, do you have any guilty pleasures? Well, episode 17 was, do you have any pet peeves? But you can ask, what are your guilty pleasures, assuming the person has the guilty pleasures, or you can ask, do you have any, if you're not sure and you want to allow the other person to share if they want to. So we're not going to go into depth about last episode, episode 17 on pet peeves, but if you haven't watched that already, I encourage you to watch the replay. That was a really fun conversation. We laughed the whole time, and I'm hoping we can repeat that this week. It's hard when you have such a good episode like that to keep going because you're like, oh, is it going to be as good as last time? So I really encourage you to consider these topics. I'm kind of trying to go even deeper than the neutral conversation questions we usually talk about because you're going to find a situation where you want to share stories with the other person. You want to swap ideas. You want to get to know the other person. So this will really, really help you have a good question in your arsenal. Be prepared with a good question that you can use in order to engage in conversation with the other person. And so, like I said, this is a question, you wouldn't probably start a conversation with this question. It would be a little bit too abrupt because you don't know the person yet. But if you've run out of things to talk about, you're trying to have a more interesting conversation at a dinner party or a social gathering, a house party, when you're interacting with people and you want to go deeper, you want to kind of lighten the conversation topic, talk about something that's fun. So like I said, today we are going to talk about guilty pleasures. But first, I want to clarify, guilty pleasures is an expression. It's a manner of speaking. Guilty pleasures really is nothing about guilt. It's not supposed to make you feel bad or feel guilty, like, oh, I did something bad. That's not what we mean by guilty pleasures. Guilty pleasures are kind of guilt-free, but they're kind of funny, and that's why we're going to talk about it. It's an expression with nothing about guilt. So you should not feel guilty about your guilty pleasures, but you might. If once you understand what it means, you might actually feel guilty about it. And this is the other thing. Guilty pleasures are about doing things you enjoy, and it is okay to enjoy things in your life. It is okay to do things that you enjoy. But for some reason, because maybe we have guilt from our religious upbringing or our cultural programming, we may feel guilty about doing things we enjoy, especially if they're not the things we should do. And that's what guilty pleasures are about. In American culture and probably in other English-speaking cultures, we talk about the word should, about something that you feel obligated to do because society tells you to do it, or your parents tell you to do it, your family. People tell you that this is a good thing that you should do. And so if you're doing something you shouldn't do, you usually do feel a little guilty or down on yourself because you're doing something you don't think you should be doing. But should is really, it doesn't really matter. We just have these pressures we put on ourselves. That's a deeper debate for another time. But I just want you to understand you shouldn't feel guilty about your guilty pleasures. I also want to emphasize that guilty pleasures do not harm or hurt other people. So if you are doing something that harms or hurts other people, that's not a guilty pleasure. That's actually something that harms or hurts the other person. Guilty pleasures are very innocent. That's why it's funny, the word guilty, but they're actually very innocent, very light, and funny. So that's the kind of conversation I'm hoping to have today. And like I said, there is kind of a cultural discussion about whether or not you should be enjoying your life as much as you are and really just enjoying things. Personally, I have the philosophy that the more you enjoy life, the better life is for you and other people around you. So I'm going to encourage you to share your guilty pleasures, to feel powerful about them and not feel guilty whatsoever. This is about feeling good about the things that make you happy. Like I said, guilty pleasures are not about harming or hurting people. It's just a manner of speaking to describe this type of experience. So to repeat, the question we're talking about today is, what are your guilty pleasures? Or you could ask, if you feel like you don't want to assume they have guilty pleasures, do you have any guilty pleasures? So a guilty pleasure is an interesting conversation topic because it does reveal something about the other person. A guilty pleasure challenges some aspect of your identity. And when I share my guilty pleasures, you'll see what I mean. So when we talk about our identity or our self-image, it's the way we think of ourselves, the way that we show up in the world. And so when you have a guilty pleasure, you feel like it doesn't exactly match your identity, your self-image, the way you see yourself. It challenges the way that you think of yourself or even the way other people see you based on what they know of you from whether they know you, like Adriana asked, from being coworkers, or if you're in graduate school or in university. It challenges something that people know about you. And that's why it's such an interesting conversation topic, is that it reveals details about the other person that makes the other person more interesting. And as you know, one of the main themes of my YouTube channel is to connect in conversation. So a lot of the questions I personally ask, and I want you to ask, are ways that you can get to know the other person, that ways that you can deepen a friendship, deepen a connection, even with a stranger. I love talking to strangers on long bus rides or plane rides or waiting at the bus stop. So this wouldn't be the first question I ask the person, but imagine you're on an 8-hour bus ride. This may come up after hour 3, for example. So this question reveals something that makes the person seem more dimensional, multifaceted. They have more aspects to their personality than what you know of them. For example, if you think of me, however you think of me, right? I always say I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills. You know, I talk about being an accent coach or a language coach. Some people see me as a teacher because that's the perception I'm teaching into the camera, right? So if you think of me in that way, when you learn other aspects of my personality, it may surprise you, or other aspects of things that I enjoy. So that's why asking about someone's guilty pleasures can enable you to find something else that you can connect to with that person. And that's why they're so interesting, because you may have this same interest in common that you just didn't know before. So that's why, like Adriana asked, it might be a good question to ask your coworkers that are like your friends, because you might learn something about them besides their kind of square image of themselves from work. And that's why it's an interesting topic. It's especially interesting if you are, at a party and you know somebody, like acquaintances or people you don't know very well. And sometimes if you ask this question, you could ask your family members. You can ask friends that you've known for a long time. If you've never asked this question, you may learn something you just didn't know because it never came up in conversation before. So I still haven't really talked about examples of guilty pleasures, but I want you to think about the situations where you can ask these questions. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about different ways people define themselves. I came up with some examples just to make sure I was prepared. So for example, some people, especially if they're university educated, college educated, they have a graduate degree, they have a professional degree, they may think of themselves as an intellectual or a professional, something like that. So this is the self-image. Maybe if you're a writer, you may think of yourself like, my identity is I'm a writer, especially published writers or people who have written for newspapers, journalists. They may feel like, okay, I'm a writer, I'm a talented writer. Or if you are a professional in a certain field, you may think of yourself in this certain way. I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm whatever. So people have a certain idea of a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, any kind of profession. I could come up with, 200 different professions right now. Any profession, they have an idea of how you should act if you're a doctor or a lawyer, right? So when we meet people who challenge this, it kind of surprises us. Maybe you're a feminist, you are very women's rights and women's purpose are really important to you. It's really important to me. So sometimes your guilty pleasures may challenge that in some way. And I'll give you an example. Maybe you're a health nut. You love taking care of your health. You exercise all the time. You're a vegetarian. I'm a vegetarian. You're a healthy eater. You eat a certain way, but you have this guilty pleasure that's not exactly healthy. So a guilty pleasure challenges some perception of you, whether it's your own self-image or your own identity, or it's the way other people see you. And that's why it's such an interesting question, because you can learn something about the other person that makes you laugh. It makes them more human. So that's kind of the goal of this question. You're going to connect with the other person because they become more human as you learn these particular questions you can ask them. So let's give some examples. So guilty pleasures, typical guilty pleasures are things like a certain movie or a certain genre of movies that you enjoy. Maybe a television program, a piece of music, like a song that you hear on the radio, a certain musical artist that you like. It can also sometimes be fashion, like something related to a certain type of clothing that you like wearing. Maybe you're a fashionista and you dress really well, but you like really comfortable clothes at home. It can be something like certain types of video games, and I have some examples of that type of, music, theater, sometimes foods, right? So these are the type of things that are considered guilty pleasures. And as you can see, guilty pleasures are pretty innocent. Sometimes the expression makes people think of things that are a little illicit or off, and it's not about that. It's really about these silly little things that you enjoy that other people may be surprised by, or that even surprise yourself, that you're a little embarrassed to admit that you like these things. And I'll give you my examples in a moment. And if you have guilty pleasures and you don't feel shy about it, that's totally cool. Not everybody feels like you should feel guilty about these things that bring you joy. Some people are really okay being who they are, and they don't care that their interests contradict. It's part of being a more multidimensional human being. But it's fun to talk about for this reason, because some people do feel guilty or a little embarrassed that this is something they like. And when you hear my examples, you may understand why. Okay, so here are some examples. For example, like I said, if you're an intellectual or a writer or graduate student, maybe you really like reading young adult books about vampires. Young adult books are books for teenagers, people who are around 12 to 18 years old. So you like reading the Twilight series, for example, or you like reading Harry Potter, even though you're an adult. Those are guilty pleasures for people because they're kids' books. Hey, Harry Potter is very well written, and a lot of people like the Twilight series. You guys can give me some other examples of series that you like reading. Sometimes if you're a writer and you're an intellectual, but you really like reading romance novels, most of the time, romance novels aren't really well written. They're very sensational and kind of embarrassing to talk about. So people feel like that's a guilty pleasure, that they're this intellectual or this writer who reads a lot of romance novels to relax. Like a lot of times these things help people relax. Or you read kids books. Personally, I don't feel guilty about reading kids books. I love kids books, but I have kids books on my Kindle. I own kids books. Like I love kids books because they're so happy. I love the kind of fantasy, the princes and the princesses. I love the kind of quests that they do. So that's an example of a guilty pleasure. Another guilty pleasure, if you're an intellectual, you may read gossip magazines. You may read the what do they call them? Tabloids. We call them tabloids in the United States when they're all about this celebrity gossip, things that may or may not be true, photos that have been falsified. Or you may read celebrity magazines like Us Magazine or People Magazine. I personally do feel a little guilty if I go to the hair salon and there's or the doctor's office, they have those magazines there, I'll read them, right? They're kind of interesting. Or on the airplane when they have those magazines. So that's an example of a guilty pleasure. Like, it's not something I would normally read a more intellectual book, but I'm reading these magazines for fun. So that's a guilty pleasure. Someone who likes good music, but also likes listening to pop music or even really cheesy pop music. So for example, right in the past, I've been really into music. I still love music, but I was really serious about my music, very particular, very picky, but I really liked Britney Spears. And those of you who are around my age know Britney is, I think, my age. So it was like Britney was so much fun at that time. I don't really like Britney Spears now, but for a lot of people, that's a guilty pleasure, like really liking Britney Spears. I also really like Justin Timberlake. I like his music even today. And so it's kind of embarrassing to be like, yeah, I really like this high quality music. I like world music. I like really good music, but I also like Justin Timberlake, or I like pop music. A lot of people feel that way about Taylor Swift, for example. I hope you guys know who I'm talking about. Taylor Swift is a very popular American singer. or even just pop music in general. I personally love pop music. I listen to it on Spotify all the time. And so it's kind of funny because it's not necessarily what you expect me to read or to read to listen to based on my personality. So you guys let me know as I go through these examples if they reflect your own guilty pleasures. Another one related to music is that I really like reggaeton and I really like hip hop music, even though sometimes the messages are kind of anti-woman and I'm very pro-woman. So I sometimes I listen to the lyrics and I'm just like, oh my God, but the beat is so good. So that's a guilty pleasure where I'm kind of embarrassed that I listen to music that's not always necessarily friendly to women. So that's another example of a guilty pleasure. And I'm sure you guys can understand if you're familiar with reggaeton or hip hop. Another thing is I'm very healthy. I love green vegetables. I love fruit and vegetables, healthy food, but I really like French fries too. So I always feel a little guilty like, oh, but French fries are so delicious. They're so salty and fried. So that can be a guilty pleasure. Or if you don't usually eat processed foods and you really like a certain brand of potato chips or a certain type of cookie that just isn't as healthy as what you think you should be eating. So that's another example. Another guilty pleasure may be someone who likes watching a TV show that may be out of style or maybe not exactly right for them or their age. I don't watch a lot of TV, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people feel guilty even about liking, I always talk about Game of Thrones or Mad Men. They feel guilty about constantly watching these TV shows or watching older TV shows like, you know, Friends is still a super popular series, but it's kind of outdated now, right? They're older now. It's, you know, a lot of things have changed in society. So people watching Friends. I still watch a TV show called Grey's Anatomy, even though it's like season 13. It's not as, well, it is kind of as good as it used to be, but it's not the same as it used to be. And I kind of feel embarrassed admitting that I watch Grey's Anatomy because everyone else I know kind of stopped a few seasons ago. Or sometimes people who love rewatching like episodes of Lost, or I'm trying to think of another example. You guys let me know if you can think of TV shows that people watch, even though they're kind of old or, you know, they're not that good anymore. They've changed, right? So it's anything you feel a little embarrassed about watching. So all kinds of TV shows. And then also someone who likes watching romantic comedies, even though they're cheesy or kind of formulaic, kind of boring. So a lot of people like watching romantic comedies. Some of my favorite movies are romantic comedies that some people may find cheesy, but I just really enjoy the story of them. So that's a typical example. Another typical example is we're coming up on Halloween. And so a lot of people like watching horror movies or thrillers that are kind of really kind of scary or dumb, but they love them because they just give you that kind of jolt of energy, or they're kind of funny now. A lot of people like Christmas movies, holiday movies. A lot of people like Bollywood movies where you know it's kind of the formula, but you still appreciate the dancing and the singing and the way people act in the Bollywood movies. So you can think of all kinds of examples of movies that you may feel like, oh, I should be watching a documentary, or I should be watching this more intellectual, more challenging movie, you know, but you really enjoy romantic comedies or horror movies, things like that. Another thing, if we talk about art, right? So I don't want to say anything negative about art, but maybe you're a fine artist. You paint these beautiful landscapes, for example, but you really like reading graphic novels or comics or watching cartoons, things that are a different type of art. I'm not saying that one type is better than other. I personally love all kinds of drawing and art and things like that. But for some people, they feel a little embarrassed, like they should be, you know, only, or even for themselves, you might have a guilty pleasure. You usually paint these like fine art things, but you also like to sketch things and draw things that are not necessarily at that level. Same thing for writers. You may be a writer and you may write these really great articles, but you also like to write, I don't know, silly little letters, or you want to write short stories or poems. People feel a little guilty about those pleasures. So those are the examples I prepared for you guys. I'm going to check in with the chat and see if you guys have been sharing your guilty pleasures. If you haven't already, I'm going to encourage you. I know some people are new to the channel. Please get your guide to more confident small talk. These are more neutral questions. Today's question's going a little bit further about things that you can ask people, but this is basically 17 questions that are useful in the workplace, when interacting with your colleagues, coworkers, people you don't know, things that you can kind of engage people in conversation about that aren't controversial in any way. So if you haven't downloaded the guide, please be sure to go to englishwithkim.com/smalltalkguide, and then you can join my email community and get all the insights and updates that I share. When we talk about guilty pleasures, there is no guilt involved in guilty pleasure. It's just an expression. So the question you want to ask that we've been discussing today is, do you have any guilty pleasures, or what are your guilty pleasures? I like using what are your guilty pleasures because people have guilty pleasures. And as you can see from this chat, when you meet somebody who has or shares the same guilty pleasure as you have a more interesting, more engaging conversation because you can start swapping ideas, you think of other ideas, you make connections. You can also turn the question around and ask the other person about that because it's something that people like talking about because it's funny. It's as long as the person's not embarrassed about their guilty pleasure. None of us were embarrassed to share our guilty pleasures because guilty pleasures do not harm or hurt anybody. It's just about enjoying your life, embracing your life. It's just things that you don't expect the person to like based on their personality. Like people are always kind of surprised that I'm like, I love Justin Timberlake, because they think, I have good taste in music. Why am I like, well, Justin Timberlake's talented. But it's like something that has a little bit of that feeling that you maybe shouldn't like this because, it's pop music and I should like more intellectual rock music or something like that. Or like we said, the TV shows, soap operas, things like that. So it's a really great conversation to find things you connect with other people. Usually when you find something you share, you saw that when Tony mentioned 90 Day Fiancé, I was like, oh my God. And then Horacio mentioned the video games. Oh my God. You get kind of excited to share because it's something you can connect over. So that's why it's such a good conversation question. If you haven't watched last week's episode, on episode 17 on pet peeves, that one also is a really great question because when you start connecting with the other person, you're like, you get so excited that somebody understands you. We all just want to be understood at the end. And I love telling you guys as non-native speakers to use these questions because then you're able to these type of questions about pet peeves, guilty pleasures, more insightful questions help you feel more fluent because you're the person starting the conversation. And once you start the conversation, then it can just flow and you don't have to do all the work anymore. Remember something I've talked about earlier in the first couple, 3 or 4 episodes of Conversations with Kim was that when you're the person asking the question, you're the person in charge. You actually don't have to do the work. And that's why I always focus on questions. But I do encourage you to also practice answering these questions because it gives you the opportunity to connect with people. If you're just sitting there and observing and just listening, people are like, oh, why aren't you talking? So this gives you a chance to kind of prepare a question you can ask, but also be able to join in the conversation as well by answering your own question. So once again, please give me a like or a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. I would love if you're watching the replay, please comment below. I love to continue the conversation afterwards. If you have any questions that you want to talk about in a future episode, leave me a comment or you can submit them to englishwithkim.com/ask so I can keep track of all of these questions because I'm always looking for ideas. I have a lot of ideas, but I like making sure I can answer your questions as well. And that's about it. If you want email reminders, the link is below the video. And I think that's good for today. Thank you so much for your participation, for joining in, for being a supporter of this channel. Be sure, if you haven't already, to watch some of the older episodes. We talk about a lot of good questions there. The one I want to refer you to is the one about how do you like to start your day? I think that was episode 4. Because these are anything about routines, things that people can learn about you tend to be really good questions. But be sure to check out that playlist. And that's it. Thank you once again. I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. Have a good one. Goodbye.